Hey folks, Marcus here from the Ashland Fly Shop, and today we're going to talk about choosing your first spey rod. This is something we really talk a lot with customers in the shop. We answer calls and emails about it quite often. And there's a couple things that I think you should think of right off the bat when you're choosing your first spey rod. And usually before I get to price or action with anybody, we have a conversation about what and where. And what that means is just what are you fishing for and where are you fishing for them. So if you're in the Pacific Northwest and you're fishing, mid to large size rivers, and you're just fishing for steelhead, maybe summer steelhead or steelhead year round, most commonly what we're going to recommend is a 12.5 foot 7-weight spey rod, or up to 13 feet. That length is kind of like the 9 foot 5-weight in the trout world. It's big enough and heavy enough to cast some of the larger flies we use in the winter and the larger sink tips, and yet it's still light enough in hand that when you're throwing a scandy line and a small summertime fly, it's really nice that time of year. There are, if your first spey rod is for Chinook or sea run browns, or you're going to British Columbia, that might not be the rod of choice. It might be a 13.5 foot rod. It might be, say you live in an area where you have a shorter river system, it might be a 12-foot rod, but in general, you're gonna land somewhere in that 12.5 foot mark. And today I've brought 3 12.5 foot 7-weight spey rods out with us to the river, and we're gonna kind of talk about the price points as you work up. But right behind getting the proper rod for the fish and the river that you're targeting them in, you want to get an action that's easy to learn on. And if you have a spectrum between really slow action rods over here and really fast action rods over here, for my first rod recommendation, I would choose somewhere in the medium fast category, or kind of pushing into that fast action. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason is a really slow rod might be nice for fishing a certain type of line, but it might not have the versatility for some of the scandy lines or things that we like to throw in the summer. And why you might avoid a really, really fast rod for your first spey rod is, though when you progress as a caster, you can kind of get more advanced with a faster action rod. In the beginning, some of that potential might not be realized, and it might be making for a little bit of inconsistent casting while you're learning. So if you're new, to rods in general, slow just means noodly and fast just means stiff. So you can always think of, how stiff is my rod or how wobbly is my rod. That's a pretty important thing to think of with your first spey rod. And I say getting into that medium fast, fast action category is, I think, pretty helpful because it's going to be a really versatile action. A rod like that has a little play through the middle, that loads through this section of the rod, is going to give you an intuitive casting experience. You're going to be able to feel the load in the rod as you sweep around your body, and I think that's really important. But the tip usually on a rod like that is quick enough. If you're doing light scandy style casts, the tip will be fast enough to kick out that tight loop. So having a rod that has an action platform that's more or less in that medium fast action is a really good idea. And after you get through the what are you fishing for, where are you fishing them, how big is the river, how big of flies do I need to cast, and you've got your action kind of nailed in, I would use price as the last variable in your first spey rod. And that's kind of opposite of how a lot of us consumers come into it. We're kind of like, oh, I want to get into spey fishing and I have this amount to spend. But it's worth going through those steps, because if you live on a really small river, a really big river, maybe you're fishing to smaller fish or bigger fish, you want the right rod for the job. We see it a lot where, you know, someone gets a rod, gets something somewhere, and then they come in and they say, how can I make it work? Time and time again, that getting something soon that might not be quite right and trying to make it work, I've just learned over my years, if you can start with a really good option in the beginning, you're just going to be so much happier. You're going to waste a lot less time on the river. You're going to waste less money in the long term. And I think that's a good option to go. So as we talk about price, we'll kind of show you these 3 rods that I'm out here on the river with. And I'll talk about the rods in particular. And we'll talk a little bit about what influences the price of the rod, so you can make sense of why a rod is 300 bucks, 400, 500, 800. And I think that's an important thing, because when you're new to this and you're looking at it, you're like, geez, I got to get 200 bucks, you know, I'm going to spend $100 on my line. Will my 7-weight reel work on my single hander? And I got to get the rod. There's a lot of moving pieces, and once you understand, you know, the value of getting a proper outfit, I think that'll help. So let's get right in that. Today I have the 12.5 foot 7-weight Redington Dually, and this rod is the second dually that they've made. There used to be a 13-foot 7, and a couple years ago they came out with the Dually 2, which is this one, and I think they sped up the tip. They made the tip a little bit stiffer, and it's a really nice action. It loads down in the rod, which is something I like. It's really lightweight and really crisp. So let's talk about what influences the price a little bit there. And when you talk about price in spey rods, major influence is where it's produced and what it's made of. So you can expect that a rod that's in this price category is imported into the country from somewhere else, which I don't think is a bad thing, but it's also made of more economical materials, which, as you can see when I'm casting, that's also not a bad thing either. This rod is super lightweight, really fun to cast. Man, I'd fish this thing any day of the week. And for a beginner, you know, we sell an outfit that's in the, you know, $500 range. You could go up from there depending on the reel. But if you're getting into the sport and you're looking for an intro outfit that's lightweight, enjoyable to cast, really versatile, but won't break the bank, I think the Dually is a really nice option. So we'll go from this rod, and then we'll look at what I consider to be the next step up, which is the Redington Chromer. So we're out here, we got the Chromer, 12.5 foot 7-weight, and the first thing that I notice going from the Dually to this rod is it's got quite a bit more horsepower. It's stiffer, doesn't seem to have as much load down into the hand, but it can turn over. I've got 25 more grains in the line than I had on the Dually, and it handles it really nice. And when you talk about horsepower or stiffness in a rod, there is a practical application for that. And the most practical application that I can explain is line speed. So a rod that's got a little more horsepower and is a little stiffer is going to react better when you speed up your cast. And that, as you progress as a caster, is something that I feel is pretty important to creating tight loops. The fishing aspect of it is, I think you'd get a little more range out of this rod than the Dually. You can kind of pull a little harder on the bottom handle. You might be able to access some different spots with this rod. And you get a rod that I would say just has a little bit of a performance advantage over the Dually. And I think that's an important thing to think about with, you know, this $400 rod compared to the Dually is at $280. You might find that you're progressing. I don't think, I get customers who ask quite a bit about, will I outgrow the Dually in a year if that's the rod that I go with? And I don't think that's the case. I think all these rods can have a place in your quiver. It's just that as you advance as a caster, you might be able to get the benefits out of a rod like this that has a little bit more horsepower. And you get a rod that's built with a little bit better components, and that's an influence in the cost too. So we'll go from this, which, you know, the Chromer has been one of the best mid price point rods that we've ever carried. We'll go from this to what is really a top shelf rod in the Sage Igniter. Okay, so I'm out here and I've got what I consider to be a top end Spey rod. This is the Sage Igniter. We're still in the 12.5 foot 7 weight category. And what I think you get with a rod like this or a similar offering is you get a rod that you're never gonna outgrow. And that's an important thing to think about when you're choosing a rod. I think all of those rods that I mentioned, when you're in that top end price category, they're produced with the best materials that they can get their hands on. They're really lightweight. They have, even though this one right here is fast, it still has a lot of sensitivity in the hand. It's got horsepower for days. As far as a rod in this length and weight, you probably couldn't find another one that has more horsepower and more just raw castability to it. When you're in the beginning phase of Spey fishing, some of that technology and materials might not be realized in your casting, but as you progress and you get better, a rod like this is really gonna be a nice tool to have. And I think there's an important point to make. This is a $1,200 rod. If you've never Spey casted before, buying this rod isn't gonna make you a $1,200 caster. But what it might do over some of the other options, it might encourage you to go use it more. You might find that because you're attracted to the rod, you hit the river more, you start to progress as a caster more, you start to get to the point where you can realize the benefits of the technology in the rod, and you progress at a higher level. And I think that might be one of the main benefits of going to a higher end offering in the beginning of your Spey casting journey. The other thing is, along the way, if you start with a premium rod, along the way, you're gonna have more enjoyment. I think that's really true. I really enjoy casting the Dually. I like the Chromer. I like a lot of different rods, but I do have to say, when I'm out on the river in my free time, I just get a lot of enjoyment out of fishing these rods, because I've got to the point where feeling the rod in a certain way and seeing a certain shape of my loop is something I'm really accustomed to. And I think, you know, for folks beginning, that might not be important, but as you stick with the sport through your first year, your second year, those are things that you're gonna really care about over time. So before we wrap up talking about how to select your first Spey rod, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the weight that you select. And in general, I would look at, when are you available to fish? and what fisheries are you most excited to target. If you're fishing primarily in the summertime and you don't think that you're going to do a lot of fall or winter steelhead fishing, then I would probably recommend a 6-weight Spey rod, depending a little bit on the size of fish that you're targeting. There's some places, BC or even the Deschutes, where having a 7-weight as you start is a nice advantage over the fish. But in general, summertime steelhead, I'm going to recommend a 6-weight for you. If you have the inkling and the time to target fish year-round, I'll definitely recommend a 7-weight first. And that's why we're out here today with 3 different 12.5-foot 7-weights, because by and large, those rods or 13-foot 7-weights are the most popular, the most useful, and the most utilized Spey rods that we sell. But there are other things to think about if you're targeting a place like British Columbia exclusively, or the Olympic Peninsula, places where really large steelhead are known to swim. Maybe getting an 8-weight is a good first rod for you. And same thing with length. This length for us is super versatile in the lower 48, but if you're fishing in really large river systems, you might want a 13.5-foot rod. And that's all stuff that I just analyze and work with customers on a case-by-case basis. What are you fishing for, and where are you fishing to them? And I think by answering those questions, we can really start to dial in the length and weight that you're looking for. And then once you're into length and weight, you can start talking about these other things that I've mentioned, like action and price. So I'll talk a little bit about, probably a much lesser known, lesser utilized weight, which is the 5-weight, which is kind of right in between your full Spey rods and your trout Spey rods. And really, it's going to be a summer steelhead rod exclusively. It's not going to have the power that you need to turn over large flies that the winter season requires, and it's going to have a size of fish limitation to it too. So for an average angler, I would look at these rod weights in terms of double the weight of the rod, and that's about the biggest fish that you'd want to try and target with that rod. So if you have a 5-weight, and you're fishing in a river where your fish exceed 10 pounds with regularity, at least in the beginning, that wouldn't be a rod that I would recommend. Here locally, where we have summer steelhead, all the way from 2 pounds up to 8 pounds, which would be a larger summer steelhead for us, I think a 5-weight's a really nice option. So you can kind of go weight by weight and think about this stuff, but in general, if the pursuit is year-round, or your target is to get one rod that you're not gonna be limited by throughout the season as they change, I would say a 12.5 or a 13-foot 7-weight is really gonna be what you're after. So I hope you folks got something out of this video, kind of explaining the factors that I think about when choosing your first Spey rod. We're always happy to answer more specific questions and give you unique recommendations by phone, by email, or stopping in the shop. Thank you very much for tuning in.